Europe has always had its darlings. There are the castles of Germany, the cafes of Paris, and the canals of Venice. All very beautiful, very charming, worthy of a postcard. But lost between France and Spain, there is a small country that completely escapes this European movie aesthetic. We are talking about Andorra. Instead of charming medieval streets, we find stacked shopping malls. Instead of squares filled with tables serving croissants and coffee, there are neon signs vying for space on narrow avenues. And while the rest of Europe fights to preserve the past, here it seems that the motto is the opposite. Let's put concrete wherever we can. But the most curious thing is that Andorra could be one of the most beautiful countries on the continent. Giant mountains, untouched nature, fresh air. But in the midst of this documentary-worthy scenery, humans decided to improvise a large shopping center in the middle of the mountains. Today on Bello Mundo, we're going to take a tour of this place that many people already call, without any embarrassment, the ugliest country in Europe. Number 1. Location and geographical data. Andorra is located in the middle of the Pyrenees, the mountain range that separates France from Spain. It has no beaches, no ports, and no airports. It is just mountains, hills, and more mountains. It is so small that you can drive across the country in a few hours. If you look at a map, you will see that Andorra looks like a little pocket forgotten between its two giant neighbors. But in this tiny space, it has everything. There are mountains that reach almost 10,000 feet, deep valleys, hidden lakes, and even a piece that has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And incredible as it may seem, almost no one is born here. Most of the people who live in Andorra are foreigners. But we'll get to that in a moment. Now, the real geographical curiosity is the altitude. Andorra la Vella is the highest capital city in Europe. It's way up there, easily over 1,000 meters above sea level. And if you climb a little higher, you reach the highest point in the country, Coma Pedrosa, almost reaching 3,000 meters. The rest of the territory is 90% pure green. Forests, trails, waterfalls, and that nature that only the Pyrenees know how to create. The problem is when concrete starts to compete with this landscape, but we'll get into that in a minute. Number 2. History. The history of Andorra is one that almost no one knows, but it holds some nice surprises. Officially, the country has existed since the 9th century. That was when Emperor Charles the Bald decided to hand over that piece of land to the Count of Urgell. And so Andorra was born, sort of like a gift from the nobility in the middle of the Pyrenees. But what really defined the country's course came a few centuries later, at the end of the 13th century. That's when they created one of the most curious political arrangements in Europe, the co-principality. Instead of a king or president ruling alone, Andorra has two heads of state. One is the Bishop of Urgell from Spain. The other, today, is the President of France. This crazy government scheme continues to this day. In other words, the French president, who runs one of the most powerful countries in the world, is also symbolically responsible for a tiny country squeezed into the mountains. And the Spanish bishop is still there, steadfast in the partnership. For a long time, Andorra was somewhat isolated from the rest of Europe. Without wars or major conflicts, it lived in its mountainous bubble while the entire continent was embroiled in disputes. When the rest of the world was in the midst of the First and Second World Wars, Andorra continued its peaceful life. It was only in the 90s that the country decided to modernize for good. In 1993, Andorra finally adopted a modern constitution and joined the United Nations. And even with this modernization, the system of two princes remains intact. Number 3. Population. If there is one thing curious about Andorra, it is precisely who lives there. Because, despite being a country with less than 100,000 inhabitants, few people who live there were actually born in Andorra. Most people who call Andorra home came from elsewhere. There are many Spaniards, quite a few Portuguese, a good number of French, and people from various corners of Europe. True Andorrans, by blood and surname, are a minority. But of course, they are the ones who make the country's political rules. This mix has created a somewhat different profile. It is a small country, but with several languages spoken at the same time. The official language is Catalan, and in fact, Andorra is the only place in the world where Catalan is the only official language. However, walking through the streets, it is normal to hear Spanish, French, and in some corners, even Portuguese gaining ground. In practice, you could say that a large part of the population is trilingual. This makes things a lot easier, especially when the country depends so much on tourism and people coming from abroad all the time. As for religion, as you can imagine, it is Catholicism. There is nothing new here, especially since the fact that one of the co-princes is a bishop says a lot about this religious connection. But in real life, the country has a much more secular profile than the bishop's position would suggest. Now, with so many people coming from abroad, you can imagine that Andorra has become a kind of peaceful bubble for many people who want to escape the hustle and bustle of big cities. But this tranquility comes at a price, and the way the country has sought economic growth helps explain why, in practice, Andorra has become what it is today. Number 4. Customs, traditions, and the cultural side of Andorra. Despite its small size, Andorra has some very curious traditions that show how the country has long maintained its isolated mountain village feel. Here, life has always revolved around nature. Families lived mainly from animal husbandry and a little agriculture, which incidentally became the country's official symbol. The flag of Andorra, in addition to its colors inspired by France and Catalonia, features 2 golden cows on its coat of arms. It is a direct tribute to this rural tradition, which for centuries sustained much of the country. Another thing that cannot be left out of our travel itinerary is the Borda. In fact, the Borda is almost a heritage site, one of the oldest traditions in Andorra. In the beginning, it was just a type of rustic stone building where people stored hay upstairs and sheltered animals on the ground floor. Nowadays, several of these bordas have been turned into charming restaurants where you can eat typical regional food surrounded by fireplaces, wooden tables, and a setting reminiscent of a little house lost in the middle of the mountains. Another custom that draws attention takes place in the summer, on the night of St. John. That's when the Falls Festival happens. This is a traditional celebration that takes place on the night of the summer solstice, on June 23rd, the night of St. John, and also on June 28th, the night of St. Peter. During this festival, torches called fallas are lit and waved, and bonfires are burned to mark the arrival of summer and the solstice. It is an ancient tradition, full of meaning, which has been recognized as intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. Oh, and when it comes to culture, Andorra also surprises with a curious detail. The country is one of the world leaders in the number of museums per square kilometer. There are dozens of museums scattered throughout the country, covering topics ranging from sacred art to collections of vintage cars. The calendar is filled with small religious celebrations, especially the day of Our Lady of Meritixell, the country's patron saint. And all this happens in a small-town atmosphere where people still know each other by name and where old customs mix with the modern tourists who flock to the country all year round. Number 5. The cuisine. If cultural diversity already catches your attention, the cuisine is not far behind, because even though it is small, the country has absorbed flavors from all over. There is Spanish influence, a French touch, and that strong Catalan style. And of course, all this mixed with mountain ingredients, which have always been part of the local diet. A dish that represents this mixture well is trinksat. Basically, it is a simple combination of potatoes, cabbage, and pieces of bacon. It seems basic, but when it arrives at the table, it looks like grandma's cooking. Well seasoned and made to warm the body in the harsh winter of the Pyrenees. Another classic is escudella, a kind of stew with meat, vegetables, and sausages, reminiscent of those hearty mountain soups. It's the kind of dish that brings the whole family together, especially in cold weather. As the country has a lot of game, there are also dishes with wild boar, lamb, and even roast kid with chopped walnuts. And for those who like fish, trout, caught in the icy mountain rivers, is also on the menu. Now, if there is one curious detail about Andorran cuisine, it is the wine. Despite its rugged terrain, the country has managed to develop high-altitude vineyards. Up there, at over 6,000 feet, they produce varieties such as Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, and Riesling. And to accompany them, there are local craft beers and, more recently, even mead production. In short, even with all its geographical difficulties, Andorra has found a way to transform what it has into dishes that carry a little of the history of those who have passed through there. And after seeing all this, you can't help but imagine the scene around that table. And that's where Andorra's most valuable asset comes in, the natural landscape that has long been the country's greatest treasure. Number 6. Postcard. If there's one thing you can't deny, it's nature. It's the landscapes. And look, nature really went all out there. More than 90% of the territory is pure green. There are forests, crystal clear lakes, deep valleys, meadows full of wildflowers, and mountains that rise like stone walls surrounding everything. Those who arrive there in spring or autumn are greeted by a view that looks like something straight out of a documentary. Mountain trails crisscross the entire country. There are more than 100 routes scattered throughout, allowing you to cross Andorra almost without stepping on asphalt. Along the way, mountain refuges offer basic support for those who decide to lose themselves in the heights for a few days. The Val del Madriu Pedrafita Claror Park occupies about 10% of the territory. It has been recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and in addition to its untouched nature, it still has old forges, stone paths, and small buildings that show how humans have adapted there over the centuries. In the far north, near the border with France, are the mountains of Ordino and Arcolis, perfect for skiing and for those looking for trails with breathtaking views. On the east side are the slopes of Canillo, where the famous suspended viewpoint of Roc del Quer is located. From there, you can see the entire valley, with the mountainous horizon stretching into the distance. In the south, the Saint-Julià de Lòria region is a little lower, with a milder climate and several small villages surrounded by pine forests. In the central part, Escaldes Engordany is home to the thermal waters that have become a tourist attraction with the large Caldea complex, the largest thermal spa in southern Europe. In winter, the whole country becomes a snow sports center. There are more than 190 miles of skiable slopes, making Andorra one of the most popular destinations in southern Europe for those who want to hit the snow. The highest golf course in Europe is also there, at an altitude of over 7,000 feet. And for those who like frozen adventure, you can even go diving in frozen lakes. It was the perfect setting to be one of those little hidden treasures of Europe. a place where nature, tradition, and peaceful life would form the kind of charming destination that makes you proud to show it off. But now that we've talked about these natural beauties, the question arises, why then is Andorra considered one of the ugliest countries in Europe? Number 7. Fame. Despite all the nature we've just seen, humans have managed to transform much of this landscape into what many people mercilessly call one of the greatest visual disappointments in Europe. It all starts in the capital, Andorra la Vella. The city is nestled in a narrow valley, surrounded by high mountains on both sides. However, instead of taking advantage of the scenery and maintaining the charm of European villages, what was done was basically to pile concrete wherever there was space. The capital is the kind of city that no one imagines finding on a European mountain. It has none of the charm of Prague or the elegance of Vienna. It is basically a narrow valley, crammed with modern buildings, shopping malls, and neon signs vying for every square foot. The buildings were constructed in a disorderly manner. They are multi-story buildings stuck together, almost always in the same grayish tone. The stone facades that gave it that rustic feel have gradually given way to concrete blocks, mirrored glass, and neon signs that take over the streets. The city center has become an endless commercial avenue. There are shopping malls behind shopping malls, perfume stores, electronics stores, designer clothing stores, and sporting goods stores, all with that tax-free appeal that attracts people from France and Spain in search of lower prices. It is no coincidence that those arriving by car from the French border are immediately greeted by Pas de la Casa, the first village inside Andorra. It is located high in the mountains, almost on the border. It was supposed to be just a ski resort, but it has become a kind of improvised shopping center, with huge hotels looking like stacked boxes, liquor and cigarette stores, crowded parking lots, and fast food signs competing for space with the mountains in the background. Further on, in the central region of the country, comes Escaldes Engordany. It is practically a continuation of the capital. In recent years, it has become one of the fastest-growing areas, with new apartment blocks, modern shopping centers, and buildings that, in practice, are closing off the valley landscape and piling even more concrete on the mountain. On the roads, things are no better. The highways that cut through the country are squeezed between metal fences, concrete barriers, gas stations, and billboards advertising cigarettes, drinks, sneakers, and perfumes. All of this is stuck to the hillsides as if commerce had been thrown there wherever there was room. The contrast is so striking that, while in other European countries cities look like something out of a storybook, Andorra often resembles a huge shopping mall with improvised architecture. And the curious thing is that it wasn't for lack of opportunity. The country had all the makings of one of those charming alpine destinations, full of well-preserved small villages, as in Switzerland, Austria, or even the small towns of the French Pyrenees. But it chose the path of fast-paced commerce, shopping tourism, and pragmatic construction. The result of this choice has earned Andorra a title that is not to be envied: the ugliest country in Europe, at least in the eyes of many people who arrive there expecting an alpine village and find instead a large open-air shopping mall stacked in the middle of the mountains. Now I want to hear from you. After everything we've seen here, do you think Andorra really deserves the title of ugliest country in Europe? Or is the problem just the expectations we create before we arrive? Comment below, I'd love to hear your opinion. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe to Bello Mundo, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next curious destinations we'll be exploring around the world. Thank you very much for joining us. See you on the next trip.